Just wanting to take a moment to also acknowledge the losses in the K'okwe community, and just take a moment of silence to send our good energy to those who we care about a lot in these communities and who have lost their loved ones. So if we can just take a moment to do that, and all those who are attending today that are holding up. Is the co-host of this session with myself, Kelly Foxcroft-Poirier, to just speak in a little framing words about why this session. So we are welcoming you with so much care. Time and again, we have felt in and heard that people want to talk about cultural appropriation, want to learn, and most of all, we're shared in the deeper purpose of wanting to do better, of wanting to move forward towards doing better for our artwork and for each other. So this is the first, well, it's actually the second time we've discussed this. We had part of the Carvers Forum at the last live in the before times, in the before COVID times. We gathered in during the Carving Forum. This topic was something that was discussed, and it just felt like we can continue to build our capacity to have conversations that need to be had for the well-being of our art forms, for the well-being of our culture, for the well-being of each other and our relational practice. So I'm here arriving not as an expert, but as a humble learner, as a person who is clear that there is a spectrum of perspectives that we can share into the center about the topic of cultural appropriation. And with a real want to invite an expansion, to open up the possibilities, instead of what so often happens in this topic where we close up and we contract. We really want to expand our ways of being together that honors the art forms of carving, that honors the deep and the depth of teachings and traditions, and shifts us really to thinking in ways of what can I use, what can I take, to considering how can we be in good relationship and respect each other and the art teachings in ways that create more well-being for each other and for the art forms, and just for a future of innovation in our art forms and possibilities for being in good relationship with each other into the future. Carving on the Edge is a space that brings so many perspectives and so much diversity. And so it is a rich learning place to be able to have and host this conversation in a good way. Last night during the opening, Haida Carver and board member Robin Rorick made a request to us as Indigenous practitioners to do our homework, but all of us to do our homework. And I love the simplicity of how that just really brought it down to exactly what this conversation is about. Cultural appropriation is all of us not thinking about the surface way we practice good human relationship and relationship to these art forms, but going deeper in understanding the teachings, the meanings, the ancestry for us all. Because we all have ancestry. We all have a place where we come from. We all have places where we are and can reflect back and bring that into our art form. When we were thinking about these sessions, some of the things that we wanted to shape it is to continue a conversation, to have this conversation and invite learning, reflection, and not shy away from the complexity. But know that we don't have to fix or solve, but really we are building ourselves up and building our possibility to learn alongside each other with grace and expansions of the possibilities for ourselves as practitioners, for the festival, and in all of our work and worlds. To create a good dialogue space with one another that is ongoing, that continues to build and continues to grow. So we're just planting seeds. It's spring. That's what we do. The opportunity to listen in, to expand our knowing from diverse perspectives and thinking that brings maybe new understanding, that brings depth, or even that affirms what we know to be true already. And we're looking to create space and place to be able to host, to confront, to love, and be kind in the hard questions with a real spirit of honesty and humility. So welcoming you all to this dialogue on cultural appropriation with just a little bit of shape, some good hosting. Really look forward to hearing the perspectives of our panelists today. And I'm going to pass the piece to my co-host, Hélène.
Thank you, Kelly. I'll speak a little bit about my perspective since being with the Carving Festival since 2016. So I learned about the Carving on the Edge first in 2016 and participated as a volunteer. And the next year I was offered a role at coordinating the Edge Art Show. So I'm sure many of you have participated in the art show before, but for those who haven't been to the festival, the Edge Art Show is a yearly part of our in-person programming, and it's an open call to all carving artists. So all submissions of carved works are welcome from anybody. And as Kelly said, with the festival being a place that brings so many folks together from different experiences, cultures, and practices, the collection of works is always incredibly diverse and really breathtaking. And at the same time, the art show has been a space that really surfaces this conversation around cultural appropriation. And it's been a challenging piece to navigate because we're aiming both to create a space that's respectful of cultural traditions, but also inclusive of all artists. So rather than keeping this in the shadows, we're just wanting to be in the good practice of shedding some more light on this complex topic. And this is a conversation that we hope to continue year after year. And this is really work that we need to all commit to doing both on our own and together, as Robin said. We know that many of you have come with really great curiosity and generosity and wanting to share in learning with us. And we know this because we saw many of you submitted cultural appropriation or similar themes as topics that you wanted to explore tomorrow with us in our virtual discussion forum. So we've decided that we're going to leave this out as a topic for tomorrow and keep the conversation just to this panel today. Just feeling that it's really important to hold a well-moderated space and to have this sensitive conversation in a good and well-supported way that contributes to everyone's well-being and lifts each other up. So with that, I'll pass it back over to Kelly to go over some principles of being well together in this space today.
Thank you so much. I'm going to ask our tech host, Bree, to bring up the principles to help support me to read from them. In the creation of this session that has been with a lot of care and thoughtfulness from our panelists and listening into one another, we have named a few pieces. Principles are a way of working together that helps us be and supports us to be in good dialogue space, that helps us be in learning with just a touch more consciousness and a little more kindness probably for ourselves in the learning. So some of what's come up and was shared by the hosting team as we were planning this is these are some things that are growing in us that feel important. So we listen deeply with curiosity instead of judgment. We speak gently and with intention. We remember grace for being in a learning space with each other and with ourselves. Sometimes new ideas come in and it doesn't always feel that great. And sometimes the expansion and growth space can feel a little sticky. So asking for good grace. Also asking for good grace with technology. So we're all learning. We're all learning a new way of being on Zoom. And that takes a little skill and sometimes it's a little frustrating. So lots of grace at the center. We're looking to expand. Like I said, we're opening the doors and windows and airing things out that are good, tough, and sometimes awkward. So our intention is not to be in a knowing space, but to be in a curiosity space. So we might not come up with like a checklist and gold stars and like feel good stuff, but we will grow the quality of our ability to have this dialogue and expand our understandings. We're going to surface just a little wisdom together. So that brings us to, we don't have the answers. This is complex. And the only way we can figure it out and go forward towards better is together. So thank you so much for being here and joining us in this good work that is about collective lifting Ichayapsta, lifting each other up as best as we can from this digital space. So also going to just talk a little bit about like, how are we going to do that? Those are great ideas. And how are we going to do that? So what are we up to in this time? So we have a little bit of our flow of our time to help us wayfind and navigate and just settle into just enough structure, just enough knowing about what we're doing to give us a good feeling and a good start, to feel like the ground is solid. So Brianne's just screen sharing the breaths of what we're in, but it's not showing up. I can do it. I'll grab it, Brianne. I think I have it open. Doop. Here we go. Teamwork makes the dream work. We're better together. So a little bit of flow of our time. We've had a welcome and just acknowledging Joe and the good work he's been doing to support the family during this week and during this difficult time. And thank you, Timmy, for the good work to hold us up and to step in that way that we hold each other up. Talked a little bit about the framing. Why are we here in Growing Principles? Now I'm telling you what we're up to today so we can wayfind together. We're going to hear a little introduction. Introductions are important in this land and in good relational practice from our panelists and ourselves. And then you as participants are going to go into a little bit of introduction and say hello to one another. You might know each other, you might meet someone new. So that's a great place to be in, to just start being in good relational practice. We're going to do hear from our panelists, Luann, Neel, and Hjalmer. They'll introduce themselves, and I'm really excited to hear from them. Then we'll use Mentimeter to make visible some of the questions that arise from what we hear from Hjalmer and Luann. So questions not necessarily going to go into the chat today, but there's a whole section where we can really intentionally think about, you know, what do we really want to talk about and know, and make that visible, and then have a bit of hearing back from Hjalmer and Luann. And then we're going to go into, oh, we're not going to have time for that part, but we're going to go into some generosity and reciprocity with Mentimeter and some closing words where we will hear about that piece about do your homework and be able to go deeper into some of our own ancestry and thinking about our strengths. So passing the piece to Hélène to speak in and begin that introduction piece.
Thank you, Kelly. Yes, so we're going to start out with just a round of some good hellos to get to know each other a little bit better. All of our hosts and our panelists, and also each other, all the participants that are here today. That'll help us just to get a little bit more grounded in this space as well. So after we do a round of introductions with the hosts and panelists, we will have the opportunity to go into small breakout rooms and have introductions with all the participants. So I'll begin. My name is Hélène Marie-Julienne Descoteaux. I'm of French and Irish descent. I'm joining today from Tlaoquiet territory, where I've been a guest for the past 7 years. And I grew up in the traditional territories of the Coast Salish peoples and Tsawwassen First Nation. And I know I still have a lot of work to do in learning the history of colonization that's specific to where I grew up, because it's likely that there's a lot of other nations that also shared those traditional lands. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. And it's important for me to be here today to sort of lean into this discomfort of not knowing, of learning something new, and also a little bit of discomfort around co-hosting. So that is my reason for being here today. Thank you, and I'll pass the piece to Kelly.
It's Hélène. Uklama Chitlumka, Sisha Aksup, Mamat Makritz MT Kelly Foxcroft-Poirier. I'm calling you from Tsumas, my territory, my home as a Sishat woman here, otherwise known as Port Alberni. It is the territory that I grew up in. Here, my homeland, I was lucky to grow up surrounded by nans and aunts and uncles and cousins, and that is a blessed childhood, to be sure. My preferred pronouns are she, her, but also welcoming the full spectrum that humans show up in, and a resounding they is also perfectly great as a pronoun for me. It's really important for me to be here today, just as a personal why. I have a deep care and love for the traditions, art forms, and teachings in these lands. And I think by being in good relationship with one another, with the land, and with each other, we can forge more well-being for us as humans, for our relatives on the land and in the forest and in the sea, as well as our art forms, because it's all interconnected. So a little bit about my why. I'm going to pass the piece so we can hear a good introduction from Hjalmer, and then Luann. True, piece to the center to Hjalmer.
Thanks very much, everyone. My name is Hjalmer Wenstob. My neutralness name is Klehpek. My Norwegian name is Hjalmer. I come from the Masu family. I'm also Norwegian and English on my mom's side. And I grew up in Hawaiian territory on Sardis Island in Barkley Sound, and have a dear part in my heart for the Hawaiian people. And I now live at Tyastanis, which is just up from Long Beach from our village of Asawasta, with my family, my wife Annika and my 2 little kids. We also run a gallery in Ucluelet, and I lived for a part of my life down in Victoria while I went to school on Lekwungen territory, which gave me a lot of great strength as well. I'm really thankful for all those nations and places that I was able to call home, and so thankful to be here today with all of you. Just reiterating that speak gently teaching that Kelly shared in the beginning. I think it's so important in these times that we're coming together. Not only are we not able to be together and hold each other up in person, but it's just a weird time right now. And so hold those close to you, very close if you can. And I really want to make sure this conversation today is centered with a lot of love and a lot of heart and care, because it's a difficult conversation and it's a lot of unknowns. And I'm really glad that Kelly has continued to drive home that we don't have answers, and that we're not here to give answers, but here to host a space and be together. And I'm very thankful for Timmy for opening up. I called on Timmy to ask if he'd open. So I do have a blanket for you here, Timmy, to thank you for doing that work for us. And I'll make sure I can come and find a time to drop it off for you. Tim is such an inspiration to myself and in his journey on language and all the great work that he does. And I'm really thankful he'll actually be joining my artist talk on Sunday night, tomorrow night, for the Carving Festival. So again, thank you very much, Kleko, to our hosts for hosting this good space, and all of you who are on the call. True.
Ela Castarla, Ikat Wagatlan, Gayutlin Lacha Mamalaklat, Luaquagils, La Umkaan, Agela Caslacha, La Quangan, La Ehishgala Gachans, Hanskache La Hoch, Awitnakwesas. Good afternoon, everyone. What I've said in my language of Kwakwala is one of the names that I've been given on my father's side of the family from the Kwagil Ikatwega. My English name is Neel, and I come from the Mama Lilakla and the Kwagil people. I also acknowledged and thanked the Lekwungen people on whose territory I live now, just thanking them for always making me feel so welcome in the lands of their ancestors. I'm really excited to be back here today. I was looking through some pictures this morning and came across all my photos of the last Carving on the Edge festival I got to attend in person a couple of years ago. And also started this discussion. So it's really nice to come back and continue the discussion. It is really a huge topic. And even since we gathered last time in Tofino, I've learned a lot more. So I really look forward to having more conversations and continuing to learn and sharing what I've learned along the way. Leila Kesla.
Leila Kesla. Kleko. Thank you to our participants for allowing us a good breath of time in our start to lay a good foundation for each other and to give us all enough clarity and a good container to have some listening and learning. Introduction is, and saying a good hello and getting a good start. In these lands, a proper introduction with a bit of depth, a bit of telling who you are, And a little bit of naming your intention is really important work. It's a really important piece of starting in a good way. And it's not just an icebreaker, but it's an important and essential step to relational practice. You know, it's not an icebreaker, it's work. And so we thank you for what we're going to do next, because we're going to take some time to sink in and be in the important work that happens before we get to work. Relationship and people is where transformation and change actually happens. It's not documents, it's not reports, it's people. And so inviting you to model what we just did with folks. You're going to be in a group of about 3 for 10 minutes. So you get a few minutes each to speak in, and I'll just put the prompt in the chat for you. We're going to speak in just like we did. Our name or our names. We sometimes have other names of where we come from. A bit about your ancestry and knowing that we're all impacted by all kinds of things. Ancestry and family of choice is also welcome here. We welcome you to speak in the territory you grew up in, if you know it. Don't stumble up if you don't know it, because most of us didn't learn the names of the territories in school, and that's because of colonization. We all are impacted. If you have some preferred pronouns or preferred names that you want to speak in, let us know. Like, that can be part of your introduction, and a tiny smidge of why it's important for you to be here today. So we're just getting to know each other and saying a good hello, just a little bit of depth and a little intention. I'm going to ask Bree to press the button to send us into our small groups. So you're going to say hello to 2 other folks in your group, and then come back, and then we'll do a second round of that, so we can get to know a few people out of the 43 participants that have come to share this space today. You might already know some of them, so it's also a chance to visit and say hello in this time of COVID where we haven't had a lot of connection. So Bree, can you press the button? We're going to share our names, a little bit about our ancestry or territory, any preferred pronouns, and why is it important for you to be here today. It's in the chat for you to take a peek, and you should see your button to zoom off together and say a good hello. Thank you so much, Bree. Laughter, which is good. So getting to meet some new people and maybe lean into seeing some folks that you haven't seen in a while. So a little bit of connection, a little bit of relationship. So thank you for that small, oh, folks are still coming back. Thank you so much. So much gratitude for that small dip into just a little visit and just a little bit of relational space, saying a good hello to one another, and just remembering that, you know, change and transformation and collective liberation, lifting each other up, you know, is people work. You know, it's not really checklists, it's not really meetings, but people moving at the speed of relationship and moving forward at the speed of trust. So thanks for just building a little bit of that in the past little bit to start us off. I'm going to pass the talking piece over to Hélène to move us into the next breath of our time together.
Thank you, Kelly. Welcome again, Hjalmer and Luann. Brianna, if you can just spotlight both Luann and Hjalmer. I just want to thank you again for being here, and I just really want to acknowledge the generosity and openness you're bringing to this conversation that can be really vulnerable, and sharing your wisdom on this topic that I know you've been thinking a lot about, not only for this panel, but throughout your whole careers. So we do have 5 questions prepared, and we have about 45 minutes for this section of the panel discussion. So if we get to all of the questions, that's great. And if we don't, because some of them are just too juicy, that's fine. We'll just do our best. And once I ask the first question, either one of you might begin, and you can just allow the dialogue to flow back and forth between the 2 of you. Whenever you both feel ready and satisfied in your response to the question, or as satisfied as we can get in this short time, just let us know, and then Kelly will ask the next question, and we'll just alternate back and forth. And for our participants, we're just going to ask you to hold any questions for now and not put them in the chat. So you're welcome to use the chat for any sort of thoughtful comments or encouraging words. But in terms of questions, we welcome you just to jot them down on a piece of paper while still trying to remain in that good deep listening space. And then there'll be an opportunity for us to collect some of your questions through using Mentimeter after this interview portion for Hjalmer and Luann to respond to. All right, are you both ready?
Ready.
So tell us about the practice and importance of self-location and how that might shift our practice at carving on the edge in a way that is about inviting and truth with ourselves.
Hjalmer?
Sure, I can go first. Thanks, Luann.
Yes.
Yeah, we brought this up the other day, and I actually really wish that the conversation we had with just the four of us or five of us, the hosts and Luann and myself, it was such a comfortable conversation. It was really beautiful. We really positioned how we want to be able to share and speak, and that guided those kind of first points that Kelly spoke about. But self-location is something that I think both Luann and I brought up really independently of each other and created this fantastic conversation. So I hope, Luann, you'll share about Richard after and that experience that you had. And I come at this from a pretty neat perspective, I think, and I'm excited to be here in a number of different capacities. So first and foremost, I'm an artist and a carver, and I've been involved with the festival for a number of years as an artist and a carver, and I've loved coming together in that space. We were just talking with our little breakout groups of how, you know, we used to just sit and carve and talk about tools all day long, and it was such a beautiful experience. So all of our fingers crossed for next festival that will be in person and sharing again. But for another capacity, we recently opened an art gallery, my family and I, focused mainly to support New Chalmers art, but a wide range of artists show in the shop with us. And we're coming into our third year, I think, running the gallery. It's just based in Ucluelet, on Ucluelet territory. And it's been a real honor to do that with my family and my wife and my kids and my parents and my brother. Everyone in the family comes and helps make it work. And at the same time of doing both those two things, I'd say more or less full time, I'm also an instructor down at Camosun College. I started there to help redesign their Indigenous art studies course in the arts department, and then moved over more or less full time into Indigenous studies. And these conversations come up all the time, especially around cultural appropriation. So when I went to redesign the art class, the first thing I said is it's a 13-week program. It's not enough time to do a mentorship by any means, to teach or to set people up to set them up to get in trouble is what I was worried about. And so, when it comes to teaching non-New Chalmers people to make New Chalmers art and only giving them 13 weeks in which we're doing that, it just didn't feel something that I was comfortable with. And so, though it's a special topics course, it's looking at Northwest Coast art, it's looking at New Chalmers art, and specifically from my teachings, we really wanted to make it about the introspection of ourself. And so the first thing they do in this art class, people come ready to make art, is I make them write and do research. And so the first thing they have to do is self-location assignment. And so I asked them to think about themselves, think about their family, where they come from, what home means to them, what place means to them, what land and territory mean to them. And, I recognize that there's no wrong answers to those questions, just like introducing yourself, there's no wrong answer. And I've had students who come and say, well, I'm adopted and I don't know, or my family was involved in the 60s scoop and I don't know. And while I was sharing this, Luann was, like writing down notes and sharing her stories with me as well. And when it came back to making art together, I taught them the tools that I use as a carver, as a New Chalmers carver. And I taught them the tools that many other Northwest Coast artists use. So students learned silkscreen printing. They learned carving with hand tools, with, a crooked knife, with an adze. And I gave them the tools in which we create work, or I create work, but asked them to create work from their own perspective. So don't go and make my art, just like I would never make Luann's art. It's about my story and my own introspection, my own self-location. And so students wrote this first paper. Some of them, they say, I grew up in Victoria. All I know is Victoria. So they made art about cherry blossoms, and very beautiful. Others went deeper into that. And I lived in Victoria all my life, but maybe my family comes from England or Norway. And I know in those breakout sessions, people were really getting in depth to where their families come from, and make art in response to that, or make art in response to being a very transient person who's always moving around and discovering, and transforming and changing. And the art that comes out of those sessions are just really fantastic. At the very end of the class, I get them to write a second self-location assignment. And it's, just to kind of remember what they did to start the course off in early September, and come December, they're changing up really so much from what they self-located about in the first weeks of class. And I also give them the tools in which to go and learn about what territory they're on. So there's a lot of resources out there to do that homework, as Kelly spoke about early on. So I really create a document of all the resources for them to go out and find. Some people say I'm a Victoria-based artist, or I grew up in Victoria. Well, what does that mean beyond that? And I know Luann spoke about being on Lekwungen territory or being on Wasanich territory, where my wife grew up, and what that means. It's a different relationship just to Victoria. And so that assignment really helps locate students and put their perspective into their own introspection, looking at themselves and creating art about themselves and their story. And I think as a Nuu-chulnjuth artist, that's what I do so much. I'm carving a family pole for my family. It's about looking back and looking to my family and to my own lineage. And when I'm asked to carve a pole for someone else, it's about me learning about their family and their story, and getting that honor to bring that to life. So self-location, I mean, it's such an important part of all the work I do, but especially in education, when I'm working as an instructor at Camosun or at UVic, it's such an important thing to do. And so every class I teach, no matter what department it's in, students do one in the beginning and one in the end. And it's so beautiful to see how much those change from, 3 months of work together. So for now, I'll leave it there. I'll speak about it more later on, but I know Luann has some great stories to share. So true.
Lila Kessler. Oh, thank you for starting off. That warmed my brains up again. This was the first time I heard that term self-locate when we had this conversation, and I just loved it because I'd never really tried to phrase it in any way. You just do. And for me, it's coming from a learning background in Kwagilth art or Kwakwakiwak art. Some of the early learning that I had was when I was in junior high school. I guess they're called middle school now, about grade 9. And this was when the school district here offered the first Native art program. And it was actually Native art and language and social studies. So we were very, very fortunate. And our cohort became sort of the sample group for what became First Nations Studies 12 eventually in the provincial curriculum. Some of the most important teachings I learned about what I understand now as self-locating is being able to recognize that what we were being taught was, first of all, part of a very long tradition, and that the art isn't just a surface aesthetic thing that we're going to learn how to make. We're going to learn how to do a Thunderbird or do a killer whale. Our first year was spent around some of our basic design and understanding the discipline of form line, but more importantly, who we were as Kwakwakiwak and the rights we have and the responsibilities we have. And it was probably more about the responsibilities and obligation we have to the traditional discipline. And so whenever I'm doing my work now, and I do a lot more contemporary work as well, I find myself very consciously thinking every time I sit down to do a work, am I a Kwagilth artist doing Kwagilth art? Or am I a Kwagilth woman making art that isn't specific to my traditions? Is it what I would call traditional work, or is it contemporary? And I got to think about this a lot when I went to Emily Carr, did my fine arts degree, and had lots of conversations with young people. I was one of the oldest students there, and had lots of conversations with young people, not having recognized that there were different art styles in the first place amongst our tribes or between our tribes. And I think we're going to talk a little bit more about that later. But I think part of the really important thing is being able to recognize that, because it situates me in my own thinking around what I'm going to produce, what rights, and maintaining only the things that we'll explain it later, allowed to make. That's the way I was learning it. I come from the Mamalilikla, the Kwagilth, the Danakdauch, the Namgris, Huikwasotinoch, and Tlawitzis. And so those are all my lineages. And because I have those lineages, I have rights to different crests from those different lineages. And so my responsibility is to learn that so that I can share with others, not only in our communities, but outside of our communities, that I come about the right to create these things through my lineage. And that's really the, I think, foundation upon which everything else I do grows from. And some of the other work I do is around arts advocacy, which is very much in the last 30 years been about um, trying to, I guess, weave together some of our traditional laws and our understandings about where we are and who we are as people with Canadian laws. And so things like the copyright law, understanding cultural and intellectual properties, and then just the rights of our artists to continue in our own practice. And then my current role is as the head of the Department of Indigenous Collections and Repatriation at the Royal BC Museum. Prior to this role, I was the repatriation specialist and the curator, and I'll be returning to the curator role later this year. But it's really interesting for me to take this artist side of my brain, is that the right side, and going into the museum with a very policy-minded brain and advocacy side of my mind, and looking at the treasures that are there in the museums and understanding why they're there and the importance of these pieces to communities and those histories. So it really overall has been helping me to think more and appreciate more about the community histories and the families who are currently still sitting without those histories because these pieces are in museums. So it weaves together every day of my life, any given point in the day or the week or the month. I find myself drawing from my experience as an artist, which I think really helps inform my policy mind in the museum, and then ultimately helps the volunteer work I do in the community around arts advocacy. And I think that this is a really important discussion to have because these are the pieces that were lost or that were broken apart and scattered in all the directions as a result of things like the Indian Act and residential schools. And I'll stop there, and I think we got some more time to carry on with that.
Just to build on what Luann was saying about the terminology, because I think that's a really interesting discussion. And that's probably the first month of teaching at Camosun. Every single semester, we talk about terminology, because I think it's really important to recognize, Luann, you know, I don't know how you introduce yourself, but I'm saying I'm an artist. I'll just say that I'm an artist. And if I'm going to be any more specific than that, I can't be a First Nation artist. I'm a Nuu-chulnith artist, or I'm a Tlaloquit artist, or I'm an artist from the Masu family. But it's really difficult to use the terms like, oh, are you a First Nation artist, or are you an Indigenous artist? And the reason for that is Indigenous is that big overarching title that we'll put on in Canada, at least, we put it on First Nation, Inuit, and Métis. So all three of those groups are Indigenous under that kind of big blanket. And then First Nation, well, there's over 630 First Nations in Canada that are registered through Indian Affairs. There's another term we'll throw out there, Indian Affairs, but all those nations have very different art practices, very different protocols and teachings. I am from one First Nation of those hundreds and hundreds that are in this country that we now know as Canada. And so when we're looking at the definitions, I've had people call me a First Nation artist. Well, I can't make art that is First Nations, this generalized topic. And I can't make art that's, you know, Indigenous either. And so I see myself as a Nuu-chulnith artist at the smallest I can be. And even recognizing that, I mean, it spans the west coast of Vancouver Island from, you know, Dididat and Pichidat up to the north. And I make art from, you know, more centralized area, but I take inspiration definitely from other Nuu-chulnith artists. And behind me is an Art Thompson piece that art was such an inspiration to myself. And he's a Dididat artist with a very different language and culture and art. But, you know, there's definitely an exchange that happens all the time through artists. I look to Luann as an inspiration as well. But the terminology we're using is definitely really interesting. And so I call Luann an artist first and foremost, but how Luann recognizes themselves is how they define themselves as well. And so in saying that, I do want to try to tilt away from some language and also recognizing that this is just from one perspective, from one place in one part of the world. I was on the first introduction with someone who's from the States, and the term used by the First Nations in the States is Indian. And you know, that's the term that's used. And so I don't ever say that my teachings are on a higher level than anyone else's, and we have to recognize that. And regardless of background, you know, we want to make sure that as long as we're speaking with a good heart and we're speaking with a good mind and we're speaking with respect, that's the best that we can do right now. That's a lot, and that means a lot for us. So I don't know if you want to talk about that terminology too, Luann, but how we introduce ourselves, but I usually just leave it as an artist.
Yeah, I often do just say artist, but I often do that as well. Really depends on the audience. Like you say, this is so complex. It's so vast a discussion, and each audience I talk with, or each group I talk with, or even individuals, it makes a big difference. And it's always evolving. Like you said, we went from what, Native to Aboriginal to First Nations, and so there's all those titles or labels that are placed on us outside of our communities. But you know, in my heart of hearts, I just think of myself as an artist more and more these days. And but I also always point out the arts advocacy side as well, because that, I think that's really important to know that for what I've experienced over the last 30 years, especially trying to get more arts organizations into our communities so that we can have these discussions, so that we can organize ourselves and our thoughts around these. We don't have, I remember somebody in the early 90s saying, we should have an artist conference. And I said, well, artists can't afford to be away from their studios. Yeah, and artists want conferences, but you know, how are we ever going to find the time to do that? But we really need to talk to each other. We don't get that luxury. um, and we need to keep learning from each other. So much has I think been taken out of our communities in terms of how we were structured to deal with the arts and mentorships and those kinds of things. So um, I think we're going to talk a little bit more about that, but I think it's really important to know that there's still a lot of work that we're doing just to hold things together for now and bring them back and revitalize them again in our practice.
Wow, thanks, Luann, because you just gave me the most beautiful bridging and segue into the next discussion piece to put into the center for you and Hjalmer to pick up. However, that was so good, by the way. So what does a traditional carving mentorship, traditional arts mentorship process possibly look like? And saying that with the framing of like, why does that maybe matter when we're speaking to the topic of a cultural appropriation? So what does a traditional carving and arts mentorship look like? And why does that matter when we're speaking into this topic of cultural appropriation? So placing that into the center and looking forward to hearing some perspectives.
Okay, my turn this time. I want to share two thoughts about that. Immediately, I got two pictures in my head. One of them was an interview that transcription of an interview I found of my grandmother, Neel. And she was always touted as one of the only female carvers of her generation. And I always tell the story that I heard through my aunts and uncles that she used to balk at that line, because she said, you know, there's women carving in all our communities. Just because the colonial view of it was different didn't mean that there weren't women carving. But in her transcript, she was talking to Marius Barbeau, who was an anthropologist. And she said that when she started wanting to learn the art, she worked with my great grandfather, Charlie James, Jakub Glas, and he would draw a picture and he would have her trace it and trace it and trace it. And the only way she was going to get to the carving part is if she first learned how to design, because how was she going to know what to carve unless she knew how to design? So the mentor-apprentice relationship had to start there. Part of while she was learning how to design, she was explaining that she would have to understand the crest that she had the right to use and to create, and that would be her starting point. But she would also learn how to do the crest from other families in case they commissioned her, because our artists were very highly regarded in our society and were commissioned all the time prior to contact and prior to colonialism. I had the same experience when I went into school, the second flash in my head, where all of the carvers like Henry Hunt, Oscar Maddle P, Floyd Joseph, George Hunt Jr. was our teacher, along with late Frank Nelson. And they used to come in and everyone would just hang out with us for the day and watch what we were doing, give us little tips as we went along the way. But our base curriculum went from going to the drawing and being able to design and create your own original design. And then we did all the painting. Then we started to learn how to create our tools. And we had to make our own knives so that they would fit in our hands. And I have really small hands, so I had to whittle extra long to get my handles exactly the way I wanted. Tool safety, how to sharpen our tools and keep them safe and maintain them. And then we would start, because we had only learned how to do two-dimensional flat design, we did a plaque, and that would give us a little bit of an introduction to how to use our knives. And we might have to do several plaques before we could move on to the next stage, which was a mask or something three-dimensional. So there was kind of steps that were followed. And when I really thought about it since our conversation the other day, I realized I kept feeling like, yeah, but we don't have those traditions anymore. We don't do them. There's no, we don't have a school to go to. But really, it's all embedded right there in the practice. Any practicing artist or mentor, somebody who's been at it for a long time, the moment they start showing an apprentice, all of those same or steps are followed, and because it makes sense and it's logical and it's safe and really enables the student or the apprentice to get a view on where each step they're going to go until they get to the point where it's up to them to continue doing their homework. I'll stop there.
Thanks, Luann. I think it's such a funny question because I think it's different in every artist's eyes, and it's different in every community and nation as well. And so I don't think, I'll probably say this over and over again because I think it's important to say over and over again, there's no right answer for most of these questions or all of these questions. I don't think we'll leave here with an answer to solve the future going forward. But when I first started carving, I mean, when I first really, did my first work was with all of my family. We carved 8 kingfisher masks for our family dance. And so I came into it not necessarily thinking about it as artwork in the sense of a sculptural piece that will hang on the wall or be shown in a museum or a gallery, but more about a piece that's going to be on the dancers, on a dancer and being brought to life in that way. And I went through, okay, it's just a series of steps. You start with a block of wood and you work your way down until it's a mask, and didn't think much further than that. And I was lucky to be surrounded by such wonderful people who really guided me. And that was my mom's father and my mom and my dad and, uncles and aunts who were around, and everyone kind of chipped in with different perspectives and thoughts that really were important to me. And we had a week to create 8 masks. And it was such a huge transformative experience. And I think that it really guided the love I have for carving and the love I have for art. And it was all those people around me who made it such an important thing. But it wasn't done. It was like, okay, we carved this block of wood into a sculpture or into a mask now. Well, then there was a lot of work to do until it got danced, until it got brought to life. And then there was a lot of work to do after. And there was a lot of work to do in all that preparation. And it was work I'd never seen before, I think. It was work I'd never been so involved in before. And so the love of carving started there, but it wasn't the love of art necessarily. I think it was something much more separate and much more beyond that I really felt we were brought into. And so it was preparing those masks for a potlatch, and then it was putting those masks away and not hanging them on the wall and not bringing them out and not, showing them off as these high art, but it was more about bringing something to life. And so it was everyone. And I think in that kind of regard, that's how all my art is. It's everyone. It's all those around me who come and chip in and add a thought here and there and keep my lines straight when I start to deviate off. And it's for my carving practice, at least, it's a whole community of people that come together. And I think I'm still learning so much every time we go and make another piece, another work. There's a movement to your hand that maybe gets honed and gets more and more, it becomes easier. But I think there's still always something new that happens every time I pick up a knife or every time we pick up a chainsaw, and recognize that tradition and contemporary, I think tradition evolves constantly. And I think so we can still call ourselves traditional artists, but I like the word contemporary because it just means of now, artists who are working of now. And as we keep going, yesterday is now tradition, I guess. And every day becomes a tradition when we move on one more step forward. But I look to all those carvers before us, and Tim Paul and Joe, David, and Ron Hamilton and Art Thompson and all those guys. And these are just Nuu-chah-nulth that I'm thinking about, who work so closely studying in the museum to bring it back for us as well. It wasn't just that we've held on to it or been able to hold on to it to the extent that we wish we could throughout history. It was a lot of work by a lot of people to do research and bring those pieces back out into the light to be seen again. And so we owe so much gratitude for those people. And so I never want to say this is how it is, because I think it's many different ways, but I don't feel comfortable teaching how to be an artist in 13 weeks, or 3 months at the college level, or, I think it's years and years and years of work. And I'm still in such a place of learning. I know, Luann, you speak about that. You say you're learning all the time. You're always doing something different and reinventing the wheel. And I think sometimes we think, oh, look what I invented. Look how smart I am. And then we look back and there's a historical piece that's doing the exact same thing we are, figured out hundreds of years ago. And it's a really humbling experience. So I think it's a lifetime of work. And my, and I'm just lucky enough to say it's a community of work that comes together to help me create work. So I'll leave it there. Luann, I love hearing you. And I do want to ask that sometime we can fit it in that you talk about Richard, because
Oh, yes.
such a great thing, especially in terms of the carving festival. Every time we did that breakout, we were talking about people coming together and sharing about tools and sharing about art and sharing about the knowledge. And Luann has such a great story about that. So true.
Yeah, and it's always so funny because my life just keeps gravitating toward the Royal BC Museum. Back when it was the Provincial Museum still, Richard Hunt and really the whole Hunt family, after Mungo Martin had started off the carving program there, Richard was doing a workshop, and it was open to anyone who was just interested in coming down, bring a piece with them and learning about knives and using knives. And the first thing he said to this group, which I just have never forgotten, was he said, I'm here to show you how I use the tools that I've created, the tools that we typically use when we carve our kind of carving. And he said, I'm not here to teach you about how to do a totem pole. I'm not going to show you how to do one of our masks. This is me as somebody who really appreciates and loves carving, showing you what I know. And then you'll have a chance to show me what you know, and maybe I'll learn something from that. So I just sat and observed, and it was just amazing, this whole group. And there was all non-Indigenous people from the community who had all different kinds of carvings, all different kinds of tools that they brought with them. And I had just never seen that before. And it was such a great moment to be witness to and to just soak up all that energy. So I carried that for many, many years. And I like what you say about, there is no straight answer. I know that what was sort of landed in my brain as far as process, because I've got that policy side that keeps me up at night. I make little lists in my head so that I'll remember. It's been, I think, 40 years this year that I have been practicing just to be an emerging carver, if I can use that term. I'm still very much a novice. And one of the things that I love about carving, and I haven't completed maybe 2 pieces in 40 years, I just love sitting there and whittling, like watching Peter Gong right now and just wishing I could hang out there and chip away at something right now. But I just love to learn about the wood. I still don't know anywhere near enough about the grain or all of those technical things I remember hearing in my classes, but I was too busy doing and just having that experience of carving. So even though I understood what our teachers, or we call them mentors now, were saying, I absorbed all of that and kept all of that. And I think mostly because I wanted to save that for a time when I could really just dedicate myself to carving. I do all kinds of, you see fabric around me. I've been doing fabric and lots of digital since I finished Emily Carr. I have a feeling that if I start carving, I'll walk away from everything else in my life and only carve all day long, which I would love someday. But I'd love to chat some more about just this whole idea of the craft of carving, I think is what Richard was getting at. He was really talking about like-minded people sharing a like-minded love for the act of carving. Pause there, hit the mute button.
Thank you, Luann. So it's funny because you both really naturally went to our next question already, which was, what is the difference between the craft of carving and the art style that we see? Both speaking about teaching and learning and the ceremonial art and the community practices around art that you spoke about, Hjalmer. So I'm going to offer that we just move to question 4, if that's okay with you.
Maybe I'll speak to the craft section just really quick because
Yeah, absolutely.
like Luann, I went and did a degree in visual arts, and I went to UVic. I did my undergrad and my master's in visual arts, and I was met with the word craft as a way to belittle what I was doing. And I'm sure, Luann, you've had this conversation as well, and other carvers and other artists have had this conversation in this, like, we'll call it the capital A art world, you know, the galleries, the real art world out there. A lot of the time they look at Indigenous art, and I'm going to use that big broad term, Indigenous art, that includes Métis, Inuit, First Nation, as a craft. So we've just studied process over and over again. All we do is just repeat the process, and there's no artistic element to it. Now, of course, we all call bullshit on it, sorry, BS on it. And we continue to do that, and we will continue to do that because that's our role, because we're not just crafts people. We are artists who go and create, and you know, it's really about bringing something to life. And that's what I've heard all my life is, you know, carvers and artists have the ability to bring something to life, and that's such a gift that we're given. And as a man, I'm so so honored to be able to be given the skills to be able to bring something to life, and especially when it's something ceremonial. So I fought and fought and fought against the word craft versus art, because they're never in conversation with each other. It was versus, it was one or the other. And so when I brought it up on our call here, I was the one who said, actually, we should talk about craft and art, because they are two different things. And I mean it, that they can come together and be one thing. But when I'm at the carving festival, there's so many people who just love the making of tools, or the working of wood, or creating something from nothing. And there was so many people who are so in line with understanding their craft, and their craft of working with tools or creating tools or whatever it may be. And I think that Luann and I both spoke to the beauty of that at the festival every year that we're there, is this beautiful love of just making and being in that space. And then there's the art, and they can be separate things in the sense that a craftsperson can follow steps, not all, of course, and I would argue against even what I'm saying, but a craftsperson can follow steps into creating an element of their craft, and an artist is doing something different. And so, especially with this festival, I've seen people of all walks of life coming to gather to just love tools, to love woodworking, to love being in that space together. And I've said it because I don't want any one of those people to feel silenced in a conversation on cultural appropriation, that they're not allowed to use an adze, or they're not allowed to use a hook knife, or they're not allowed to use New Chalna style tools, or Kwakwaka'wakw style tools, or Northwest Coast style tools, because that's not the case. And I think that story about Richard Hunt saying, I'm going to teach you how to use my tools, and teach me how to use your tools, or teach you how you use my tools. It's such a beautiful thing. And so I did want to just state that I see those two terminologies sometimes really opposing each other, but I think in this conversation they can come together. True.
Absolutely. And I'll just tag on to that, as I've always seen, as far as craftsmanship, it's more along the lines of the when you're talking about the technical things. How do you use a straight blade to create the angle that you want to cut and the depth that you want to cut? And I always think of that as really technical, whereas the artistic and the stylized is the genius. That's what comes from the individual. That's their original true creation, and that's what comes from their heart and their experience. And like you say, people can be taught. I've been taught so far how to do a little bit of carving. I'm not a carver though yet. So I think that it's balancing out, and it ends up in context. And I think, yes, this idea of using the term craft as a put down, that was very much the case right up until probably the early 70s, when we started to see some different approaches and the different kinds of exhibits that were happening. The BC Indian Arts and Crafts Society, there were all kinds of different things happening each decade. And I think that the discussions around it are changing, but we're still not out of that yet, because was such a long period where some of our art was considered a dying art, and that's where we had shifted into being artifact instead of art. As a whole other discussion for another day about those discussions we have at the museum with artists, and very much encouraging our artists to come into the museum, get a look at those really historic older pieces, and use that as inspiration to bring things back into our ceremonies as well. Pause.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for diving deeper into those distinctions between craft and the art and how they can be harmonious or they can be referred to quite differently. Tell us a little bit about your perspectives on good practice, honesty, and integrity in the carving arts. So the honesty and integrity piece, perhaps coming a little bit back to that self-location, and then good practice as well.
Okay, I think in terms of good practice, well, putting the three of those together, to me, that's what is woven into some of our early teachings when we're doing our particular tribal styles. And because what I was saying earlier, that it's all interwoven, we're talking about when we're specifically, for me anyway, when we're specifically doing our own style of work, when I do Kwakiutl art, it's obviously Kwakiutl art by its shapes, its forms, its content, and the origins stories that I'm portraying through my work. The maintaining the integrity of that work is really important, and I'm really fussy about where my work goes, because it's not just me. I'm representing my whole family, my extended family, and any one of my tribes that I descend from. So maintaining that first as the important part, and also making sure that the messages that those stories or legends or histories were meant to tell are carried through in my work. That doesn't stop me from being super creative in my contemporary practice. And it's such a wide, blurry line between the two, but I try to keep a little bit of a separation between the two, because I'm still really exploring and learning a lot in my contemporary practice. But when it comes to what I consider my traditional art, those are usually just things that not just things, those are things that I make only for our ceremonies, and they're not meant to hang on a wall like you were explaining with the pieces that you put. My thing was 14 button blankets, matching dresses, and aprons in 4 weeks. And so, because we had to quickly get ready for a feast as well. And I was learning as I went. I'd only done a couple of button blankets up until that point. But I think that in terms of the larger practice, it's about the honesty piece is about being honest with myself about what I'm going to create and projecting that out. I always share what my pieces are about through the artist statements, and being real and not taking anything that belongs to another family. I feel like in our generation that went through this first round of teaching in a high school setting, we were also bringing back part of that era of bringing things back into ceremony. So there's still so much I'm still learning about that, but it feels like a really big responsibility and an obligation. And I think that feeling of responsibility and obligation really sets the tone for how I go about my practice, how I remain honest in my practice, and how I maintain the integrity of our stories. I've been asked several times to take on my dad's side of the family, one of our legends, and turn it into an animation, which was really exciting, and I really wanted to do it. And I got about halfway down the path discussing that before I realized, you know what, this isn't just my legend. This is our whole family's legend, and our tribe, actually. I would have to go back and get an okay, as far as I know, from all of them, that it's okay to create this kind of an animation with a story that belongs to all of us. And I started stepping back out of that particular way the project was being proposed. And I came back and I said, you know what? I think what is meant to happen here is that we can draw teachings from this story to create this contemporary work, but we don't have to tell the full story. That full story is only to be told in our big house, in our ceremonies, the way it is. I can create something more contemporary, and because your intent is really important. The intent of creating that animation was to teach young people about staying positive and the integrity of their own work. So that's just one small example of the processing, the kinds of processing that I feel like we have to do when we're balancing between traditional practice and contemporary practice, and some of the things that we draw from. That's the integrity piece for me. Thanks.
Thanks, Luann. Yeah, we spoke about this in our meeting too, of what these you know, if morality and humility and honesty were the markers of success, we wouldn't have to be having this conversation, I think. Because cultural appropriation, in the conversation we're having, we're not defining it. And it can go to an extreme where we're seeing corporations actively stealing artwork from individuals, from nations, from historical records, and recreating them as product that they're selling with no kind of nod or acknowledgement or anything towards the nations or the artists that they're taking from. And then we see it kind of work its way down into every level, right down to the individual. And in that, the response to it, I see a lot of the time, comes with a lot of frustration and anger. And there's a reason behind that. And I think the reason isn't spoken enough about, except in other spaces. So we can make the acknowledgement here, I think, that we understand a bit of history of Canada. We'll start throwing around big terms like colonization, which can instantly kind of mute the conversation, I think, a lot of the time. But we can understand some of the history that's happened over the last, let's say, 200 years. And in that conversation, a lot of negative things have happened, along with some very positive things as well. But we can look at things like residential school. We can look at things like the 60s scoop. We can look at things such as assimilation practices, which really tried to remove culture from people. And without getting deep into that, all that anger and frustration from a number of people comes into every conversation, including this one. So when they see an individual appropriating artwork, all the frustration and anger from all that big backswell lands onto that one conversation. And all that frustration and anger get hammered into this one point. And I think we have to really understand that and speak with humility when we're having these conversations, but also say, okay, we understand that now. How do we continue this conversation around honesty and humility? And this is where that element of self-location, I think, came out in our talk. And I think this is where our homework will come from at the end of the talk as well. We should just be honest with each other. If I go and make kwak-wak-wak art, I hope that Luann will be honest in the saying of, Hjalmer, what are you doing? You know, why are you making kwak-wak-wak art? Or how did you come to make kwak-wak-wak art? Or just tell me a story, because that's how Luann is. And we'll get to a point where I can explain my positioning and why I'm doing it. But I shouldn't go and say it's New Chelmsford art. I shouldn't go and say, oh, I'm a kwak-wak-wak artist, because I'm not. And I can make that acknowledgement, and I can still be honest with, you know, with my practice as well. And I think so there's so many layers to what does honesty mean? What a question. but I think it's how we bring honesty into our practice. So if someone's, non-First Nation, if they're Second Nation and they're making First Nation artwork, just say it. That'll be a really, really important first step. Say who you are, speak about who you are, be honest with who you are, or if you don't know who you are, be honest about that too. And it really, just sharing that acknowledgement of each other and of ourselves, I think is such an important thing. We're sadly seeing, I think, with the movement of technology and with the movement of things like CNC machines and scanning and all this kind of digital world that's expanding way faster than I think we're used to expanding. We're seeing a lot of the time Luann's pieces being copied. We're seeing, galleries who have photos up online, all the pieces are being copied and reproduced by individuals, by large corporations, by, companies overseas. And we're losing the integrity of the piece and that history that's so important into it, or the transformed history, and that fact that we're only telling a little bit of that story. And it's being reproduced without any of that acknowledgement, without that story, without that truth and honesty behind it. And so I think that comes with a lot of frustration, again, from artists, from knowledge keepers, from community members who really want to put some humility and truth back into it. And so one thing that I think is so important is just to say who you are and where you come from. That's why I think the beginning of this talk was so positioned on saying who I am. This is who I am, and who are you? And that conversation in itself is something that's so important. And I think something that the festival really wants to take away from this discussion. So maybe I'll leave it there for now, because I think we're going to come back to this in a more full conversation in a while. True.
Thank you so much, Luann and Hjalmer. And thank you for speaking in just the way that words matter, the way that context matters, and that these are all considerations when we're thinking about this terminology of appropriation, of like, what context are you coming from? Why are you doing what you're coming? So intentionality. Some of the conversation that we had that was really good that I want to lean into is we've heard about how this isn't just like me understanding who I am and my right to use these particular images and my deep responsibility to them. But also we heard a lot of stories from each of you of how you represent yourself. And by speaking in how you represent yourself, modeling, what we'd like to see from others. But we're also thinking about representation and misrepresentation. And that's the honesty piece that we're speaking in terms of like, honesty of practice, integrity of like, you know, really representing ourselves in ways that have honesty, that speak to like what we don't know and what we do know. So we have kind of a last, we're stretching into our time a little bit, but I think it's important to get this last question in. So in the shortest way possible, can you tell us a little bit about authenticity and about that term authenticity that's like connected to the appropriation conversation? You know, we're sort of untangling some things a little bit. And Luann, you spoke to this a little bit as well, but leaning in a little bit and tell us a little bit about authenticity in that term in the arts when we're having these larger conversations about appropriation and representation and misrepresentation and responsibility, all the layers.
Biggest question, smallest time. Okay, let me go bullet. Okay, when we were talking the other night, I was talking about an initiative called Authentic Indigenous. I worked on 6 years ago, and it was really about being authentic in that honesty realm again about who you are. And what I was encouraging artists to do was we were setting up a website, wanted their artist bio, and some of them would say, you know, I'm not from your territory, but I was taught by artists from your territory. I said, well, what you need to do is talk about that. You need to tell the story of who your mentor was, because one of the practices we have, or that I was talking about earlier, my little checklist, that you're acknowledging your mentors, you're acknowledging who taught you, who inspired you, or who's guided you along your artistic journey. So there's that part of it. There's so much wrapped around that word when it comes to commercial and sales, commercial markets and sales. I think it's deserving of its own full day discussion around authenticity. I don't have any 2 days. Yeah, I don't have any definition around it. I just always ask people to just be clear about where they're coming from, because otherwise what you're I think leaving yourself open to is the criticism that, when, like Liam was saying, all the weight of all those other observations start to land on you. So just as good practice as artists, being really thorough in the way we talk about our work and where it comes from and who taught you. If you're not from that nation, who were your teachers? That's important for us to know in our communities.
Yeah, what Luann said, that's great. I'll try to go quick as well. I think that it's a difficult question, because there's definitely not an answer here, and there's not even an answer in the conversation of identity and pinning that kind of title down, especially right now. And we're in it feels like the whole world's kind of transforming right now. There's a big change and a shift going on, and we see it all across the globe, where there's a kind of a swell, or maybe it's a pendulum swinging back and forth. And I think we're at one of those points where it's going to start swinging back the other way, because it feels very extreme right now. And I think COVID's played a big role in that, but it's just, a lot of politics and identity has played a big role in that as well. In Canada, we have, I try to say Indigenous, First Nation, Inuit, Métis. First Nation people have a big kind of hurdle of identity to talk about as well, if we're talking about status and non-status. And some people are considered more authentic in that context. It's a government policy that was enacted in this country, where I have status, but I'm only half, and we're going to talk about blood quantum because of this. So my kids don't have status. So if I, keel over tomorrow, my wife and kids get evicted from their house because we're living on the reserve. And though they're my children and I am a status Indian, which makes me no better or more important than anyone else, they aren't welcome here anymore. And there's all these definitions of identity that are so problematic right now, that again, all that frustration boils up and it comes so close to the surface. And I feel that we have to be really careful in those conversations of what authentic means. And I think what authentic means is stop. Let's not say First Nation. Let's not even say Nuchalnath or Tlaoquit or Masu. We'll just say Hjalmer, and I'll be as authentic I can be to myself, with that responsibility I have to my children and to my ancestors behind me. And that will be how I'm going to call myself authentic or not. And that just means who I am. Be who you are, recognize who you are, be proud of who you are. Don't carry something that isn't yours to carry, or it doesn't need to be carried. We all have work to do. There's a lot of work to do, but to carry it in the weight of it, that's not our job. It's none of our job. I'm a generation or 2 generations away from some really horrible history behind me. And that's not my job to carry it. It's my job to remember it and to do good work now. But other people have carried it and they put it down as well. And so that responsibility element is I think as close as we can get to what authentic means is the responsibility to ourselves and to our ancestors, but also to those ahead of us. And I have two beautiful children trying to crawl on my lap here while we're talking about this. And that's who I want to be authentic towards. Shoot.
Beautiful. Thank you so much for the invitation and continuing to lean into that spirit of offering and expanding our thinking about what do these words mean. You know, we throw words around and we kind of grenade them and pellet them at each other historically. And so just really welcoming and enjoying the space and the conversation that expands and that is an opening for lots of possibilities. So thank you, Hjalmer, for ending that with like an invitation in a lot of ways. And so everyone's been holding their questions and just such respectful, so acknowledging our participants for incredibly respectful listening. So often lately in the Zoomiverse, in the change from our in-person world, you know, when we're in an in-person presentation, we don't start yelling our questions and our needs at the presenter. But when we're on Zoom, I keep seeing people just like pelting people with things in the chat. So thank you for holding that. What you have to say and what's in your heart is so important. And so now we want to give the time and space to allow and bring that forward and make it visible so that we're all learning together. And so we are going to use a platform called Mentimeter. It's a poll that offers a link that makes our learning and our wondering, in this case, visible. And so in a moment, Bree is going to share a screen that offers an opportunity to invite, you know, what's stirring for us, and specifically, you know, what are the things that we want to ask about cultural appropriation, but might be even shy to ask or afraid to say out loud. So Mentimeter also allows us to do that without speaking it out loud and feeling like we're the ones asking the silly question. So you're going to get a link in the chat and have access to a link that'll be placed in the chat momentarily, and it'll bring you to a screen that says that looks like this, and you can click into the box and answer and submit. You can submit more than one time, but please take a moment to head into the chat, click on the link, and offer in for everybody and for yourself. What are all the things you always wanted to ask? What is stirring from these things you've been hearing? What maybe is bubbling up in you that hasn't been addressed yet? Is the opportunity to center that a little bit. So I'm going to turn on, Bree is going to unshare. I'm going to turn on a song and music. Folks, head to the chat and double click the www.menti.com. We're going to give a few minutes for everyone to place into the center a little bit about what you've always wanted to ask. What do you want to know? And if you can't get to the Menti, I do not want that to be a barrier to sharing your thinking. So please also use the chat to respond to what are all the things you always wanted to ask about cultural appropriation, but have been too afraid or feel a little shy about. So turning on a little bit of music in the screen share, and we'll give a few minutes for the responses to come in.
Nice tunes.
Okay, folks have had a few minutes. So what we're going to do now is screen share and make visible to everyone. Also the invitation that Hjalmer made, we're expanding, we're open. All questions are good questions because we can't get to better knowing without being able to ask. Oh, thank you so much, Bree. So taking a peek at this, what we're inviting Luann and Hjalmer is to maybe don't scroll too much. If you can pause the scroll, you gotta press enter, Bree. Lots of good things coming on. Oh, you double clicked on one. This is where Grace with Technology is good. Okay. So we can scroll page down now. Hjalmer and Luann, inviting you if you see either of those you want to respond. Oh, it's still scrolling through.
I can start if you'd like, Luann. I'm
Sure.
just looking at the question on the right. How to teach carving? Is it acceptable for a settler to teach carving in a respectful way? And again, I think this is a bigger and broader question. And even is it respectful for an Indigenous artist to teach carving in a respectful way? And how do we go about that and hosting that space in the right way? And yes, there's definitely ways to do it. And what does that mean? And what kind of carving are you teaching as well is another kind of element to that question. As we were on a bit of a break there, I was just thinking of the word teachings, because I think it's an important thing to speak about, similar to the word protocol. And my wife, as we were just taking a break here, my wife said, well, you know, remember, I'm really glad you said that. It's about yourself first. And it kind of reminded something that I do when I teach carving, is to remember the word isak. And for those people who know that word isak, in Nuu-chulnjuth, we translate it to mean respect, as if it's like a one-word translation. But it's really not true. It's not a one-word translation. Isak is a greater respect for all beings and things, but it can't start out there. You know, it doesn't start, my respect can't start out here, and it can't even start here. It has to start right here. And so before I can go and respect my partner and my kids running around and my family and my space, my house, I have to respect myself. And that can mean anything from, you know, waking up in the morning and washing my face. It can mean having a cup of coffee because that's what I need to be able to function. It's respecting myself in the simplest ways, and then going out further into what does respecting myself mean? And how do I hold that space? And before I can respect anyone else, before I can reach out further and start in that work of teaching or hosting a space, we have to look after ourselves first. And so, yeah, I mean, teaching carving, how do I do that? It's about passing on tradition. It's about passing on your own teachings. It's I would say going and sitting down with some carvers and saying, how do you teach? And how do I go about doing that? What skills do I transfer and how do I share them? The act of holding a chisel or a knife, the ways in which you swing an adze, all those things they take years and years. And I still feel like I'm learning every time I pick up a different tool. I have to fit it into my hand the right way. Luann was saying, making your own tools before you start, so it fits your hand, and feeling that in itself is years of teaching. And so, of course, there's ways to do it in a respectful way. And I'm thankful that that passing it on and teaching is something that you're looking to do. I think that's a really wonderful thing to hear. So teaching the artwork, now that's a whole different thing. I know a lot of people who just go and pick up a book and say, okay, I'm going to copy this exactly. Or I'm going to teach someone how to copy it exactly. There's nothing, I don't think, I mean, I think there's a really important practice to recreating. I don't think there's an artwork necessarily in just copying. And this is what we see a lot of the time, where an artist will make something and someone will come and just copy it. And they say, now I'm a native artist. Well, no, there's a lot more steps to it than just copying. And that word of inspiration versus appropriation, I think, is something we didn't even get into, because the terminology, we could sit, like Luann said, 2 days on each question, I think, at least. We look at, I had this argument with my grandfather before this talk. He called me and said, I'm going to argue with you about this talk. I look at someone like Picasso. He said, Picasso, he used, you know, African inspiration for his work. And I said, yeah, he did. I agree 100%. Now go pull up the African work that he was inspired by and pull up his paintings, which I went and did before this talk. And they're very different. You can see the inspirations, the beauty of the movement, that he was inspired by, but he didn't go and create African art in the same way. And so there's so much we can learn from each other. And I learned just as much from, I think the term used was settler people teaching. I learned from everyone around me, and I think we're very thankful for that. So I'll leave it there. Luann, you can pick the next one or continue on that one if you want. Shoot.
Wow, you just said everything I want to say about that question, so thank you. There was one up there about there, if someone shares something with me, is it mine to use? Just scroll back up again there. This is just above that one. Yeah. This is one of my probably most frequently asked questions, and the one that I learn more about every year that I'm present and focused on it and trying to find ways to share about it. And this is what I often tell artists, especially emerging artists who are really anxious to create stuff to go out into the commercial market, that selling or sharing artwork in Canada, I think what we really all need to remember is that all of us artists are protected by several pieces of legislation around who can take our art and do other things with it. And then actually the law is that if you create something, it's automatically copyrighted to you. You don't have to send in a form. You don't have to mail something to yourself and leave it sealed. And there's all kinds of different practices that have been I think developed over the years, but the act is very clear that you have your copyright for the rest of your life and 50 years after your death. Within the Copyright Act as well, though, is the moral rights, and artists never give up moral rights. They can assign the right to copy, the copyright, over to somebody legally and in writing, but you never step away from having the moral rights. So people can't take your existing work and change it 10% and call it theirs. So there's this great discussion that I've been having lately, last couple of years, with artists around understanding that all artists, not just Indigenous artists, not just First Nations or Inuit or Métis, all of us, I think, need to appreciate that. And just going back to what Hjalmer said around, if you're just copying, you're not doing artwork per se, you're copying. And I know for me in art school, my biggest thing was when I wanted to explore the idea of, well, what do I do when I'm inspired? Because I studied Picasso and I really love Cubism, and I wanted to create my own version of a Cubist version of a totem pole. That doesn't mean I'm copying Picasso or Cubism. I was drawing from it, and I never did finish that. Me and two other students got really interested, and we were competing with each other for 4 years on who could come up with the most Cubist looking totem pole. But I love that the discussion is still there to have. What I'm always trying to do, turn people's eyes away from, is this idea that Indian art or Indigenous or First Nations art is in the public realm. So it's there, free for the taking, especially stuff that's in museums that no longer technically has a copyright attached to it. It still has cultural and intellectual property attached to it and moral rights. So that's just how my brain works around that stuff. When I see some people talk about, can I share it? If you buy an artwork, doesn't mean you get to take it and reproduce it, or even if someone gifts it to you, to take steps to change it at all. I'll stop there.
I'll just tag on to the same question, if that's okay, Kelly. So the question about sharing something, it's such a hard one, because I don't want to say how any other artist does a mentorship with anyone else. So I would never speak on behalf of another artist who's doing a mentorship. Let's say Luann trains someone, regardless of background. It's not my place to say, regardless of teachings of mine, Luann does what Luann does. I would never say Luann doesn't have that right, because that's not my right as an artist or a Nuu-chah-nulth person to say what Luann's right is in their teachings. And so it's such a hard one to say yes or no to. Now, in saying that, I think about it in another realm. Let's move away from the arts for a moment. When someone shares their story, their experience, that can be very beautiful or very horrific, is it your story to share when they shared it to you? So what I do as an artist, or what I do as, when I'm sharing my own histories or my own stories, I'll only share what I know will probably be taken. That's how I look after it, to protect what I do. If I share a story with someone about my lived experience, well, it's probably going to be shared again. So I know a lot of the time we're trying to rein some things in that we want to keep, in our ceremony or in our potlatch behind closed doors. And that shouldn't be shared. Those masks that I created that are danced and they brought to life, I don't share those. I don't bring them up and say, hey, take a look, because I know the moment it's out there, the chances of it being, I'm going to say, more taken is higher. And especially with us being online now, I think one thing about sharing is it comes down to what you're gonna do with that. What are you gonna do with the gifts that are shared with you? I find sometimes I hear a story and it'll be, let's say it's a really heart-wrenching story, and then maybe that story will help me change the perspective in which I live day to day. And I hope that story, as I carry it with me, will do that work. But I'm not gonna go make a film about that story and tell someone else's story as if it's my own. And if I do and I get permission to do that, I'll say, this is not my story, it's their story that I'm bringing back to life. And so we have to really remember our positioning all the time. So it's not really an answer, I don't think, but it's just to show the complexity of it. Now there's a whole nother question, which I'll get to, maybe we'll have time. If not, it's the transfer of funds. And that definitely is something that brings up a point of friction for a lot of people. So I'll leave that one for now.
True. Thank you so much. We have about 5 more minutes to pick up another one of these. We only have 6 brave souls out of our 40 participants that have something that they're really wanting to ask, and they're really good questions. So offering for you to dip into what you were just speaking to, Hjalmer, around the transactional piece. I don't know if that's the right word, now that I feel like words really matter.
Yeah.
Rises up in me right now and just completely authentic. Can you speak to that? Or we have what is more important, the tool that you use or the quality of your product? Does it need to be hand tools only? That sort of comes out often. And another one about holding integrity to your mentors, educators, teachers, the touchstone for practice in a good way. Wildly open to how you want to use this last bit of time to respond to sort of what's coming up for folks.
I want to very briefly just say something about the tool question, what's more important. I always say that our elders really loved having new tools. My aunties and uncles talked about how my great-grandfather loved it when he was able to access new paints and new tools, and adopting those. This is the living culture, and those things became available and he started using them. So technology also, if it weren't for our elders embracing technology when it came to audio recording, some of our songs would have been completely lost with their passing. And so I'm a big fan of not everything has to be done by hand. I actually started cutting all my own jewelry, all of the pierced cut designs, and ended up with carpal tunnel and was unable after my first year of practice, had to stop. And so out of necessity, learned digital design so that I could do some of my work by laser. And I think it's about creating the artwork. It's not always about it being handmade. I love making as much as I can by hand, but some of it I just can't. So I think that's a piece that needs to stay open for discussion, because we often hear, I hear a lot from museum professionals around the world, well, it's not authentic because an Indian didn't make it with their hands and use all the traditional tools and didn't use a chainsaw or anything modern. So that, I think, discussion is slowly starting to drift away and not be so prominent anymore, but I'd like to keep that discussion open as well. Thanks.
100% agree, Luann. I've heard that over and over again of what's authentic when you're making something, and our people have always evolved. That's why I say tradition, I think, is an evolving, it's always evolving. We can still call ourselves traditional artists as contemporary artists, and we make these definitions. Of course, language, I really hammer at home that the words we use are really, really important, and that's why I want us to speak gently about the words we use. But both, I think the tools that we use and the work we make are equally as important. And I think the reason that I know a lot of the older carvers and even younger carvers make their first set of tools is so they respect what goes into the making of their first set of tools. If you've made your own set of tools, you care about that set of tools. You don't throw it in the bucket across the shed or drop it on the concrete floor and watch it break. The thing now is you can go to Canadian Tire and buy a set of chisels for 13 bucks or 20 bucks. And it's easy to not care and respect those things. But I think that that act of making and creating is always something that gives you respect. And I think that I don't know many carvers who don't respect their tools if they made them or not. And I think that really comes back into the work when you're seeing it. So I use a chainsaw. I use a whole pile of tools from, you know, other carvers who have made them, or, you know, it doesn't matter where, but I think that love of making things by hand is still really important, but I don't think it makes anything more important or gives precedent to anything else. So ending with the money conversation, Kelly, is that with the next one? Because I think that's an important thing.
Yes, so if there's a quick bit for that, Joe and Christopher have their hand raised, so I'd love to hear if there's something they would like to place in, just welcoming Joe's and Christopher's voice. And then I have a few pieces to read on the chat. So maybe five more minutes, and then turn over to Joe and Christopher to say, to speak in. I saw they raised their hands, so I hope I'm acknowledging that properly and that that's true. Brianne, I think we're done with the screen share, so we can go back to speaker view. Thank you. So Hjalmer, you were speaking into the monetary, money, green energy place of this.
Yeah, the bad green energy. Yeah, the money element comes in so many ways, and I think there's a long history around that as well, in which we've seen our objects through the potlatch ban being stolen, moved away from the realm necessarily of cultural object and the art object, and a huge amount of monetary gain that grew from having those objects. And so the art world kind of created through a long history that it wasn't art necessarily to start with. I'm not saying it wasn't artistic, but a lot of the things that were now hang on the wall, such as a mask, originally had a history a long time before that held a different purpose. And so there's been a long history, and in that history, Indigenous art, Nuu-chulnjuth art, Northwest Coast art, whatever terms we want to use, has become a market. And there's no doubt about that. I use that market. I know Loanne uses that market. Many other carvers use that market. So I don't want to say it's a bad thing, but we have to acknowledge that history that's come. That history also came with a huge amount of negativity, which I don't want to get into. I don't think it's the right space for it. But we see people are just now, we're having things like the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. We're just in the very beginning of the truth part of that work. There's a lot more truth that needs to come out. And sadly, a lot of that truth that is coming out is very, very heavy and painful. And people are really having to start questioning history. We're questioning what we've learned in school. We're questioning what we're learning now. And it feels like a lot has been taken away, let's say. And some people are able to carry that space in a different way. I'm thankful for all the things I still have. And I'm thankful for the things that we still have access to, but a lot has been taken away. And so I know a lot of people, you know, our art is one thing that we're holding on to. And when we see people taking it, not for the beauty of the culture and the art and the importance of it, but for the reward of being in that space, I know a lot of people fight against it and push against it. Again, recognizing this huge history that's kind of built up. It feels like things are pushing and about to break. And around this conversation, I know the transfer of funds, when someone doesn't have that lived authenticity, if that's what we're going to say, I don't mean ancestry, I mean authenticity. That's when it starts to get this kind of a bad taste and a frustration I've seen from other people. And I don't really want to get into it to point fingers or hurt anyone, because I don't think that's even the reason for that being brought up, but the recognizing that there is a long history there. So I'll leave it there for now and throw it to Luanne.
I don't know if I can say what I need to say in 2 seconds flat, but I'll agree with what Hjalmer said and add that the work that I've been doing around clarifying and public education, I think where I want to spend most of the next few years is in public education, and I think deconstructing some of those things that we did learn in schools, because I think that's one of the biggest barriers, and the lack of information and the absence of information around the fact that the whole appropriation discussion, the whole commercial market. I hear people say, well, you know, you used a chainsaw, so therefore we can use your design. And there's this swap out culture thing going on. And no, that's not the case. These are, I have to keep returning to cultural and intellectual properties. They belong first to us. And I think we have to go back and revisit those things, because it's been all of the things that have made this commercial market, just for starters, where the study we did a couple of years ago was 88% of the products sold in Vancouver's market, a gift marketplace and tourism sites, has nothing to do with Indigenous people whatsoever, and doesn't benefit Indigenous people and isn't done by Indigenous artists. So that's a real sticky point, and especially when the right of the consumer to make an informed choice to buy something from an artist who created it themselves or from a big corporation. I think it's disempowering the public to leave this discussion, as tough as it is, not defined a little bit and clarified around that history. Again, too long to get into, and really difficult and challenging to talk about and try to get a solution to. There's so many pieces to it, but I just want to say that I've heard just about every question being asked in every way about this topic. And what I just keep coming down to is we all need to work together on public education, asking the kinds of questions each of you is asking today. I really appreciate the honesty, that your courage, and just putting those questions down in the chat, letting us know what you're really interested in knowing. That helps me as an advocate to create the kinds of spaces where we can keep that discussion going. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Lynn. And just, we have some wise voices in our midst. So many, everybody knows something and has some good wisdom. But Joe and Christopher, you had your hand raised. So just giving, mindful that we have 15 minutes and have to head into some reflection and closing space really quickly. But wanting to also invite in your voice as you have your hand raised. So handing it over, talking piece to Joe. Going to speak in what's in the chat after you're done and pass it to Hélène.
Thank you. I feel that what is really abandoned in cultural appropriation is making the West Coast canoes out of fiberglass, because that's really taking away from the teaching of our art to the younger generations. Plus, also, that the forest companies continue to take all of our best cedars. They're still doing it. They're doing it to us. That is a real big concern to me, because that's the way I like to teach people about carving, is to go right into the forest and get a windfall or a log there, and then carve it and bring it out. And that is about the importance of teaching the protocols of why our people would have done it that way. Because, in the former days, the forest companies never existed, and we never had to ask anybody for anything. We didn't. Please bring me a log so I can carve a canoe. And I don't like those things. And so, one of the best ways of teaching about these, I feel, is to go into the forest and find the material you need and carve it there and bring it out. That's putting us back in touch with the land, because the Indian Act and the governments, they created the reservation on which we had no rights outside of that thing. But here, as Tlaloquet, we don't have a treaty with anyone that says we don't have to ask them. We have to ask them anything. It's not theirs to ask, it's ours. And I did say it earlier about tree farms. You go to the store, you can buy stuff from there, right? You buy your wheat, you buy any manner of vegetables or fruits even. And the farmers planted and grew those things and stewarded them and delivered them. But I guarantee you that the forest companies did not plant those trees. I carved a canoe over there in Powell River several years ago, and the students came and counted the rings of that tree and figured out that seedling fell as a seedling 10 years after King Henry VIII died. And so I can say they did not plant those trees. And any of these trees along the coast here, and Yeah, there's, so you know that even with the forest companies taking all this wood, all this best red cedars that we have left, that is cultural appropriation. And they're taking it for pennies. To make a canoe like this thing behind me here, to buy a log that size, it's about $10,000 just for the log, one log. 10,000 bucks. And that's why they don't want to let you take it, or they don't want to let me take it, but our people have no treaty that says we sold it to anybody. So it's still ours, and I don't ask anybody for it. I go and do that according to the protocols and the teachings left from my father and my grandfather. There's teachings and protocols according to them that left us all this stuff. So, you know, I like to talk also about art in the way that certainly, you know, when the Europeans arrived here, we were illiterate. We could not read any of this stuff on the screen. But so were they when they arrived here. They had no idea what are on those totem poles. And to me, what are on these totem poles and all the crests that are sitting behind us here, those are our teachings of natural laws, our teachings of respect for the land and our connectedness to this land, the names that we carry. And that name comes with a responsibility about teaching the laws of the land and about carving canoes too. And when I was with my father and my grandfather, they told me that trees were never cut in the spring and the summertime because of those birds that may be nesting up there or building a nest. It was against the law of the Creator that we do anything like that. But today the forest companies is cutting all the time, any day, nests or no nests, nothing, they don't care. They take it all. And they're targeting all of our best red cedars. And I do not like that. Because to me, that is cultural appropriation. True.
Thank you for offering that important perspective of speaking for the land as a participant in this work, especially the carving arts and thinking about the protection of our old growth. And just bringing together and tying together what Hjalmer and Luann were talking about too, like the way that our monetized system is creating so much harm. Just acknowledging in the chat that there's some really great contributions to the center, you know, both in thanks for a discussion that is complex and also acknowledging that there, you know, we're having this discussion because there has been historical harms. There was some inquiry and wanting to deepen into knowing about art and craft and just acknowledging, and I think there's lots of great resources. We're going to offer a resource bundle on a follow-up that Hélène will talk about, acknowledging that this conversation is, you know, about acknowledging the work of respect and acknowledging our own place, our own teachers, our own location with honesty in whatever work we're doing, in whatever way we're representing ourselves. Acknowledging and appreciating also that we're having this conversation because there's been impact and there's been disruption, and shining the light onto the efforts to revitalize the practices, revitalize the culture, revitalize the governance that's happening alongside. So that work has to happen in tandem. You know, we cannot have light and possibility without acknowledging the shadow. So I appreciate the way both of those things are brought in. Our people are taught to be in wholeness. We're not ignoring any part. So acknowledging the way that this brings up feelings for folks. And just a real invitation when thinking about Isak, observe. We've been in learning with each other about how, about the history, about the terminology, you know, unpacking some different perspectives. Appreciate the work that's been offered to the center, the work that's been done historically, and act accordingly. is shifting from these terms of like use. You know, this isn't about what we can use. This isn't about, and shifting away from extraction. Joe was just talking about extraction on the land. Shifting away from that to care, to stewardship, to a space where we are in these three words that I've heard our speakers speak so much about: respect, relationship, and most of all, responsibility and care. And so I'm going to pass the piece to Hélène to move us into a little bit of reflection for us to do and to center some of what we've learned, to reflect and gift back. So our speakers have given us so much in this space, and to be in good generosity and good reciprocity, we're going to do a little exercise before we move into closing words.
Thank you, Kelly. Yes, so we're going to be using Mentimeter again, which we've all had a little bit of experience with now. So Brianne, you can get that ready. And she's just popped the link in the chat box. So this time it's going to be around sharing some reflections on our learning today. As Kelly said, there was a lot of really deep and thoughtful knowledge shared with us. And so just creating a little bit of space at the end of our conversation here to integrate this so that we can put it into practice when we go back out into the world. And in this way, by making our responses visual, we're also offering some witnessing and creating some accountability to what we've received today. So our first question that we're going to reflect on and offer your answers into the Mentimeter box there is: what is the gift you received? And we'll just give you a few minutes to think on that and submit your responses. So as soon as we have some responses coming in, you can share the screen again of the results coming in if they're ready, or if some have started to come in.
So am I dreaming, or is this just how we're living now? Refuse to wake 'cause I have never been this close. You always think I'm leaving before I've had the chance to stay. Darling, it'll be okay if you look me in the eye. If you look me in the eyes and say now, don't be afraid of fire, babe. I never let you.
Thank you so much
All right.
for some of these really great reflections. I'm thankful for the opportunity, teaching that ESOC begins within before you can show respect for others, a community of artists, a sense of community built around the sacred practice of creativity, community in the conversations of cultural appropriation. I'm thankful for the opportunity to participate, and that Hjalmer and Luann for being the voices to hear much needed discussions about the challenges of cultural appropriation. So some of the gifts that are coming in. The gift I received was the honest discussion. I realized while listening today that I think less about whether something is art or craft and more about whether it is a piece I do for sale or trade or a piece for, I'm not sure what the rest of that is. For ceremony. I try not to impose too much of myself when I make for trade or sale. Mhm. Thank you so much for your contributions, and those can continue to come in. The link is available if you've opened it to enter for a few more minutes. But in the mindfulness of time as a participant in our piece, just gonna speak in one that came in on the chat as well. Just being able to participate and listening to a much bigger audience has been nice. It helps to understand in a compassionate way. So thank you so much for that contribution in the chat. We have one more reflection piece just to like take us from downloading information to just contextualizing in a little bit. You know, we have a lot that's gone into our head and into our hearts. And now this next question is asking us what is in our hands to go out into the world. So when we do this important witnessing and listening work, we have a responsibility to it. You know, we heard a lot about responsibility today. So in the chat, Bree has just put a new Menti link that's going to ask you about what are the gifts you're giving. You've received a lot, and we need to be in good, you know, receiving that generosity. Now in reciprocity, how are you going to carry that forward? How are you going to carry forward what you learned in a good way? Expand your capacity, continue your learning in the conversation in your work and world. So what can you give back in this from what you learned? What can you give back from what you learned? What is the gift you are giving? So we'll give a few minutes to get some responses there. Also feel free to respond in the chat if the Mentimeter link is not working for you. So we'll just play a little music for a minute and wait for some responses to come in. And then we'll view the
When the ashes of lost love make it hard to breathe, my love, if we burn, would you burn right next to me? And there's so much revealed where you take the time to know me for who I am. I'm just who I am. Don't be afraid of the fire, babe. I'd never let you burn. No.
Thank you so much, Bree, and thank you to everybody for your contributions. So some of what folks are considering and how they, from what they receive, what they're going to give back. I learned a lot, and here that I can bring to discussions with my students at school and apprentices at home. I can bridge between settler and First Nations communities through education and the language of art. Continuing to share some of the knowledge that was offered today, I would like to find a mentor in our traditional way, carving ways, and as Hjalmer said, to learn to create pieces for ceremony, for telling cultural stories, and to come from an authentic place as myself, one person, a part of a larger whole. I'm grateful for being welcomed and being part of truth telling. Appreciate hearing about cultural appropriation of the cedars from Joe. I will pass this information forward in life. So thank you all for the good giving and the good receiving, for the deep listening space that we've been in. We have in the chat, the gift of understanding and being open to listening to difficult conversations. So we've just built some muscles and expanded our capacity to continue what is the start of some learning for some of us, and to continue to deepen this ongoing and continued conversation around cultural appropriation. We're tipping a little into 3:30, but we're wanting to pass over to closing pieces. So I'm going to pass to Hélène to talk about the follow-up email and what's next, and then we'll go into closing words.
Thank you, Kelly. So just really quickly, I want to touch on that in about half an hour from now, we have 4 different films premiering on our YouTube channel. And so the links are in the chat box, or sorry, not the chat box. We've been talking about the chat box so much in the newsletter that you would have received as your festival passport. So there are 4 films curated by Gordon Dick. One is a walkthrough of his gallery. The other 3 are really rich, candid conversations between Gordon and carvers Kelly Robinson, Tim Paul, and Joe David. And then tomorrow morning at 9:30 to 10:30, we have an open carving area to start out the day. And I just wanted to touch on this because Hjalmer, you said that you miss sitting and carving together and talking about tools. And that's exactly what this space is for. So even though Zoom isn't exactly the same, we're trying to replicate a little bit of that environment. So be really casual, bring your coffee, bring your breakfast if you want, and just bring the projects that you're working on. So to close out for today, we wanted to provide some follow-up homework and resources, because as we've mentioned, this is really ongoing work and a lot of it's personal work. So we'll be sending out all festival participants in our newsletter, probably sometime late next week, some resources and a self-location exercise, which will be about creating your own biography and an opportunity to deepen and reflect in your own ancestry, identity, and unique art styles and learning that's accessible to you. And I'm not sure if Luann or Hjalmer, you'd like to touch a little bit more on the self-location exercise. Hjalmer's really generously offered to share some of his resources that he shares with his students as a teacher to do the same exercise.
Yeah, so I have 2 courses that I teach that are very introductory level courses at Camosun College. And I have written, they're different assignment. One is mainly based in the arts and responding to Northwest Coast art, particularly the New Chalmers art, through your own story. And the other is Introduction to Indigenous Studies, and again, through your own story. And so the assignments there, I'm going to edit them a little bit just to take out some of the resources I don't think are going to be helpful to you, but I did want to offer them if people want to see that assignment and even try to do the exercise. It's not meant to be anything arduous, and of course you don't have to do it. It's just what I do hand my first year students. And I'm also going to send along the part 2 of one of the assignments. So usually I ask students to write a self-location in any way they want with some guiding questions. And then at the end of the semester, I offer them another assignment, recognizing that a lot has changed since they did that first one. And throughout their whole time at Camosun, if they're in the department, I keep giving them these assignments and changing it up every time and rewriting the course description every time or the assignment description every time. So I'm going to offer that. And the great thing about it is there's no wrong answers to introducing yourself and telling your own story. There's nothing you can do wrong. I think everyone who does this assignment at first, they find it really daunting and scary. Then they find they get 100% on an assignment because they're just talking about themselves and their own knowledge of their own their own story. So I offered to send it along to Carving on the Edge, and if people do want to use it as an exercise, I think it's great for creating an artist statement as well, or an artist bio. If you're going to be showing your work, it's an exercise that will hopefully help with that. So true.
I'm so thankful that you're able to share that, Hjalmer. I have similar stuff, so I'm going to leave mine alone, but I think that that's a really important exercise to always just keep doing over and over and over again. I think and I keep copies of all of the bios and the artist statements that I do each year. And so I had to go buy a 4 terabyte hard drive because I plan on updating it constantly. So just really encourage people to do that because it really is a wonderful exercise. Sometimes the hardest thing to do is to talk about yourself. And this is a really great opportunity to share what you feel. You can keep it to yourself and then turn it into a version that you share publicly, but a wonderful exploration into, I think, positioning yourself as to where you are in this great big discussion we're having. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Luann, and to Hjalmer for your generosity. Moving into closing words. To close us off, I think that we had Joe, if he wants to come up and say closing word. He looks comfy though, so I feel really bad asking. We're a little tipped over 3:30 a little bit. Thank you so much for everybody's participation, generosity, and deep listening in this learning space. So passing the piece to Joe for closing us off in a good way, and wishing everybody well as they travel with open hearts, open minds, and lots of good things in their hands. Passing the piece to Joe.
Oh, It's been a really awesome day today. Thank you all for being here, and I just share a prayer from the late Chief Dan George. O great spirit, whose voice that I hear in the wind, whose breath gives life to all the world, hear me. I'm small and weak. I pray for strength, not to be greater than my brothers or sisters, but to fight my greatest enemy, myself. Make my hands respect the things you have made. Make my ears sharp so that I may learn the lessons you have taught to our chiefs and elders. So that when life fades, as a fading sunset, I can come to you with straight eyes. In great spirit, I give you thanks for the many blessings I have received and for all these people that are on the screen today. Boom, have a good one.
Beautiful. Just inviting everybody to unmute and say, as we say in this part, choo.
Ha, choo.
Choo. Thank you very much.
Wakasla.
Shoo, shahuti. Take care.
Enjoy the films. Enjoy the festival. Keep learning. Thank you.
Thank you.
True.